Picture this. Deep beneath the marble floors of the Vatican, past the tourist routes and beyond the reach of cameras, lies a chamber that doesn't appear on any architectural blueprint. The air here is different, thick with the weight of centuries and the scent of old parchment. Along the walls, filing cabinets stretch from floor to ceiling, each drawer labelled with codes that mean nothing to outsiders, but everything to the select few who hold the keys. This isn't the Vatican secret archives that scholars occasionally glimpse. This is something else entirely. Something the Holy See refers to, in hushed whispers, as a containment event. And at the centre of it all, gathering dust in a climate-controlled vault, sits a collection of documents that the Church has spent 800 years trying to forget. Documents that trace their origins to an order of warrior monks who once held the power to topple kingdoms and reshape the very foundations of Christianity itself. You know their name, the Knights Templar. But here's what you don't know, the story you've been told about their dramatic fall in 1307, about their supposed heresy and their treasure vanishing into legend. That's not the whole truth. It's not even half of it. Because what happened to the Templars wasn't just the destruction of a military order, it was the beginning of the most sophisticated cover-up in human history. A cover-up so complete, so methodical, that even today, 7 centuries later, the Vatican maintains an entire department dedicated to ensuring certain truths never see the light of day. What I'm about to show you isn't speculation. It's not conspiracy theory wrapped in medieval romanticism. It's documentation. Real documentation that suggests the Knights Templar didn't just discover something explosive during their time in Jerusalem. They became something explosive, something so dangerous to the established order of things that their very existence had to be erased from history, rewritten, sanitized, and locked away behind walls that have never been breached. Until now. See, there's a reason why every few decades Hollywood releases another Templar movie, another treasure hunting adventure, another quest for ancient relics. It's not because audiences love medieval history, it's because somewhere, buried deep in our collective consciousness, we remember. We remember that there was something different about these knights, something that set them apart from every other religious military order of their time, something that made kings tremble and popes lose sleep. And that something, according to documents that have recently surfaced through channels I cannot name, had nothing to do with gold or silver or precious stones. It had everything to do with knowledge. Knowledge so profound, so earth-shattering, that it could have rewritten the entire narrative of Christianity. Knowledge that suggested the Church, for all its claims to divine authority, was built on foundations far more fragile than anyone ever imagined. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start at the beginning, or at least where the official story begins. The year was 1118. Jerusalem had been in Christian hands for less than 2 decades, wrested from Muslim control during the First Crusade. The city was a powder keg, surrounded by hostile forces, its pilgrimage routes plagued by bandits, and worse. Into this chaos stepped 9 French knights, led by a man named Hugh de Payens. Their stated mission was simple: protect Christian pilgrims travelling to the Holy Land. 9 men. To protect thousands of pilgrims across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Even by medieval standards, this seemed laughably inadequate. But King Baldwin II of Jerusalem didn't laugh. Instead, he did something extraordinary. He gave these 9 unknown knights quarters in the most sacred site in all of Judaism, the Temple Mount, the very location where Solomon's temple once stood, where the Ark of the Covenant was said to have rested, where the presence of God himself was believed to have dwelled on earth. Why would a king grant such unprecedented access to 9 relatively unknown knights? Why would he allow them to establish their headquarters literally on top of the ruins of the most holy site in Jewish history? The official chronicles are strangely silent on these questions. They tell us what happened, but they never explain why. And here's where the story gets interesting. For 9 years, these knights protected exactly 0 pilgrims, 9 years. Not a single recorded escort mission. Not one documented rescue. Not even a patrol report. Instead, they spent their time doing something else entirely. They dug. Day and night, beneath the Temple Mount, they excavated. They carved tunnels through solid rock, following passages that seemed to have been mapped out in advance, searching for something with the focused intensity of men who knew exactly what they were looking for. What they found down there in the darkness beneath Jerusalem would change everything, not just for them, but for the entire structure of medieval Christianity. And when they finally emerged from those tunnels, they weren't just 9 knights anymore. They had become something far more dangerous. They had become the keepers of a secret that could shake the foundations of faith itself. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Within months of their return to Europe, the Knights Templar went from unknown crusaders to the most powerful organization in Christendom. Kings sought their counsel. Popes granted them unprecedented privileges. They became exempt from local laws, answerable only to the Pope himself, free to travel across borders without interference, to collect taxes, to mint their own currency. They built a network that stretched from Scotland to the Holy Land, from Portugal to Poland. Castles, commanderies, churches, all connected by a communication system more sophisticated than anything Europe had ever seen. They became bankers to royalty, financiers of crusades, the backbone of international commerce. In less than 2 centuries, they accumulated wealth that dwarfed the treasuries of nations. But wealth alone doesn't explain their rapid rise to power. Plenty of organizations had money. What the Templars possessed was something far more valuable. They had leverage. They knew things that others didn't. Things that made even the most powerful rulers think twice before crossing them. And this brings us back to those Vatican archives, to those containment protocols that are still active today. Because what the Church discovered, through sources and methods that remain classified, was that the Templars hadn't just found treasure beneath the Temple Mount. They had found proof of something that called into question the very legitimacy of papal authority, the divine nature of church doctrine, the exclusivity of salvation through Catholic sacraments. The documents refer to it cryptically as the Jerusalem Discovery. Scrolls written in languages that predated Christ, genealogical records that traced bloodlines back to biblical times, astronomical calculations that revealed the true dates of religious events, and most dangerous of all, alternative gospels that presented a version of Christianity so different from orthodox teaching that it might as well have been a different religion entirely. These weren't just historical curiosities, they were weapons. Weapons that could be used to challenge the Church's monopoly on religious truth, to question the divine mandate of kings, to suggest that the power structures of medieval Europe were built not on God's will, but on carefully constructed lies. The Templars knew this, and more importantly, they knew that the Church knew they knew. What followed was a chess game played across centuries, with the fate of Western civilization hanging in the balance. A game where the stakes were so high that losing meant not just death, but the complete erasure of your order from the pages of history. And that's exactly what happened. On Friday the 13th, October 1307, when King Philip IV of France, acting in coordination with Pope Clement V, struck simultaneously across Europe. Thousands of Templars were arrested in a single coordinated dawn raid. Their assets were seized, their leaders tortured, their secrets extracted through methods that made the Inquisition look gentle by comparison. But here's what the history books don't tell you. The raid failed. The most important Templar commanders weren't captured that morning. The most crucial documents weren't found in their strongholds. The treasure that everyone talks about, the gold and silver that supposedly vanished without a trace, that was never the real treasure at all. It was a decoy, a carefully orchestrated misdirection designed to hide what really mattered, because the Templars had seen this coming. They'd had years to prepare, decades to plan for the moment when the Church would finally move against them. They'd scattered their most dangerous knowledge across a network so sophisticated, so carefully concealed, that even today, the Vatican's containment protocols are still trying to track down every last fragment. What they're looking for isn't gold. It's genealogies, bloodline records that stretch back through the centuries, connecting names and faces to events that official history claims never happened. Maps that show not buried treasure, but burial sites, not where riches are hidden, but where truths are buried. And scattered throughout these documents, appearing again and again like a recurring nightmare that the Church can never quite wake up from, is a single word that explains everything. Merovingian. You've probably never heard that name before, and there's a reason for that. The Merovingian dynasty ruled much of what is now France from the 5th to the 8th century. They were kings, but not ordinary kings. They claimed something that made every other royal house in Europe look like pretenders. They claimed divine blood. Not divine right, which is what most monarchs use to justify their rule, but actual divine ancestry. A bloodline that traced back not just to ancient nobility, but to something far more dangerous to church authority. The official histories tell us the Merovingians were replaced by the Carolingians in a peaceful transition of power. New dynasty, same kingdom, nothing to see here. But the documents in those Vatican vaults tell a different story. They speak of assassination, of forced exile, of a systematic campaign to erase not just a ruling family, but the very memory of what that family represented. And here's where it gets interesting. The Knights Templar weren't just random crusaders who stumbled upon ancient secrets. They were the inheritors of something much older. Their founding members, those 9 knights who dug beneath the Temple Mount, they carried names that appear in Merovingian genealogies, families that had served the old kings, bloodlines that had preserved not just wealth and status, but knowledge. Dangerous knowledge about who really held legitimate claim to rule Christian Europe. What they found beneath Jerusalem wasn't treasure in any conventional sense. It was validation. Proof that their ancestors' claims weren't legend or propaganda, but documented fact. Scrolls that confirmed bloodlines. Genealogical records that traced connections between biblical figures and European nobility. Evidence that the divine right to rule didn't flow through papal appointment, but through something far more direct. The implications were staggering. If the Templars could prove their claims, if they could demonstrate legitimate descent from biblical royalty, then every crowned head in Europe was a usurper. Every papal decree was invalid. Every tax collected, every war fought, every life lost in the name of divine authority was based on a lie. But proof cuts both ways. The same documents that could legitimize Templar claims could also destroy them if they fell into the wrong hands. And by 1300, the Templars found themselves caught in an impossible position. They possessed the most dangerous information in the medieval world, but they couldn't use it without destroying the very system that had made them wealthy and powerful. King Philip IV of France understood this perfectly. He didn't attack the Templars because he believed they were heretics. He attacked them because he knew they weren't. He knew they possessed legitimate claims that could overthrow his entire kingdom. But more than that, he knew they possessed something even more valuable. They had the locations. You see, the Jerusalem discovery wasn't complete. The scrolls and genealogies the Templars found were copies, fragments, pieces of a much larger puzzle. The originals, the complete records, the undeniable proof that could rewrite history, those were hidden elsewhere, scattered across Europe in locations that only the highest levels of Templar leadership knew about. And this is where the story takes a turn that even the Vatican's containment specialists couldn't have predicted. Because the Templars, facing extinction, didn't just hide their treasure. They weaponized it. They created what intelligence agencies today would recognize as a dead man's switch. A system designed to ensure that if the order was destroyed, their secrets wouldn't die with them. They recruited families, entire bloodlines, to serve as custodians, not just of wealth or documents, but of memory itself. They established protocols for preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations. They built redundancies into their system, ensuring that even if most of their network was discovered, enough would survive to keep the truth alive. The Vatican discovered this the hard way. Every time they thought they'd finally contained the Templar legacy, new evidence would surface. A family in southern France would produce genealogical records that shouldn't exist. A monastery in Scotland would reveal hidden chambers containing documents that predated the Crusades. Archaeological discoveries would uncover burial sites that confirmed claims the Church had spent centuries trying to discredit. Which brings us to the modern era, to those climate-controlled vaults beneath the Vatican, to the reason why a medieval military order still requires active containment protocols 700 years after its official dissolution, because the Templars succeeded, not in preserving their order, that was always expendable, but in preserving their secret. And that secret, according to the documents that have recently come to light, isn't just about medieval politics or ancient bloodlines. It's about something that's still happening today. The families they recruited, the bloodlines they preserved, the knowledge they scattered across Europe, none of that disappeared when the last Templar was burned at the stake. It evolved. It adapted. It found new forms, new guardians, new ways to survive in a world that had seemingly moved beyond the need for ancient secrets. But here's what the Vatican's containment specialists have discovered in recent decades. The world hasn't moved beyond anything. The same forces that drove medieval politics, the same questions about legitimate authority and divine mandate, they're still operating today. They've just found more sophisticated ways to hide. The modern world likes to think it's moved beyond the age of divine kings and papal supremacy. Democracy, secular government, separation of church and state. These are the pillars we've built our civilization on. But what if those pillars are standing on quicksand? What if the same bloodlines that once claimed divine authority are still operating today, just wearing different masks? This is where the Vatican's containment protocols shift from historical preservation to active monitoring, because what they've discovered over the past several decades isn't just that Templar knowledge survived, it's that it's thriving. Hidden in plain sight, woven into the fabric of institutions we trust, encoded in systems we take for granted. The breakthrough came in 1978, during what Vatican insiders refer to as the Luciani Event. Pope John Paul I had been in office for exactly 33 days when he died suddenly in his sleep. The official cause was a heart attack, but the documents that surfaced in the aftermath told a different story. Luciani hadn't just been investigating financial irregularities in the Vatican Bank. He'd stumbled across something much more dangerous, a network, a web of connections that stretched from medieval banking houses to modern multinational corporations, from ancient noble families to contemporary political dynasties. Names that appeared in Templar documents from the 14th century were showing up in 20th century financial records. Bloodlines that should have vanished into historical obscurity were instead sitting on corporate boards, holding government positions, controlling media empires. But it wasn't just about wealth or influence. These weren't simply old families that had managed to preserve their fortunes across the centuries. They were custodians, keepers of something that went far deeper than money or power. They were preserving knowledge, maintaining protocols, following instructions that had been passed down through 30 generations of careful succession. The Vatican's investigation, codenamed Operation Veritas, uncovered patterns that defied rational explanation. Archaeological discoveries that happened to occur just when certain families needed them. Historical documents that surfaced at precisely the moment they could influence political decisions. Academic research that consistently supported claims about ancient bloodlines, funded by foundations whose ownership structures disappeared into legal labyrinths spanning multiple countries. It was as if the Templars had created a machine a self-perpetuating system designed to gradually shift human consciousness toward acceptance of truths that would have been revolutionary in medieval times, but could slip almost unnoticed into the modern world. Democracy hadn't eliminated divine right monarchy. It had simply democratized it, spread it thin across institutions and bloodlines until it became invisible to anyone not looking for it. The most disturbing discoveries came when Vatican researchers began tracking modern genetic studies. The same families that appeared in Templar documents were submitting DNA samples to genealogical databases at rates far higher than statistical probability would suggest. But they weren't just tracing their ancestry, they were confirming it, validating claims that had been made in manuscripts hidden for 7 centuries. And the results were consistent, unnervingly consistent. These bloodlines didn't just claim descent from medieval nobility. They showed genetic markers that traced back to regions and time periods that aligned perfectly with the most explosive claims in those Jerusalem scrolls. Markers that suggested connections to bloodlines that official history insisted were either mythical or extinct. The Vatican's geneticists, working in laboratories that don't appear on any organizational chart, began to understand why the Church had fought so hard to suppress these claims. It wasn't just about political authority or religious doctrine. It was about something far more fundamental. These families weren't just claiming to be descendants of ancient kings. They were claiming to be descendants of figures so central to Christian theology that proving their lineage would require rewriting the foundation of faith itself. But genetic evidence, no matter how compelling, still required context. DNA could prove bloodlines, but it couldn't prove divine mandate. For that, you needed the complete records, the original documents, the proof that the Templars had spent 9 years searching for beneath the Temple Mount. And this is where the Vatican's containment efforts took a dramatic turn, because in 1994, something happened that their protocols had never anticipated. The documents started coming home, not through theft or infiltration, through donation. Families that had guarded Templar secrets for 25 generations began approaching the Church directly, not to expose the truth, but to return it, to hand over artifacts and documents that their ancestors had died to protect, placing them back in Vatican custody where they could be properly secured. The pattern was always the same. An elderly patriarch or matriarch, often the last of their line, would make contact through intermediaries. They would speak of burdens carried across centuries, of knowledge too dangerous for the modern world, of responsibilities that were becoming impossible to fulfill in an age of digital surveillance and genetic analysis. Each handover brought new pieces to a puzzle that the Vatican had been trying to solve for 700 years. Not just genealogical records or historical documents, but practical instructions. Maps showing the locations of other caches, codes for accessing hidden archives, names of families still carrying pieces of the larger truth. What emerged was a picture of organizations so sophisticated it made modern intelligence agencies look primitive. The Templars hadn't just hidden their secrets. They'd created a living system of preservation and transmission that had evolved and adapted across centuries while maintaining its core mission. Each family knew only their piece of the larger puzzle, but the pieces were designed to fit together in ways that would reveal the complete picture to anyone who gathered enough of them. The Vatican's archivists began to understand they weren't just dealing with historical preservation. They were managing an active threat. Because every document that came home revealed the existence of others still out there. Every bloodline that surrendered its secrets pointed toward others that were still operational. Every cache that was secured suggested the existence of others that remained hidden. By 2003, Operation Veritas had evolved into something unprecedented in Vatican history. Not just an investigation, but a negotiation. The Church found itself in the bizarre position of conducting diplomacy with an organization that had officially been extinct for 7 centuries. Not through direct contact, that would have been impossible, but through the families and institutions that had become the Templar legacy's living embodiment. The negotiations were delicate, conducted through intermediaries who often didn't fully understand what they were mediating. But the terms were clear. The Church wanted complete disclosure. Every document, every artifact, every piece of genetic evidence that could validate or discredit the claims that had haunted them for so long. In exchange, they offered something that no other institution on earth could provide: absolute secrecy, permanent containment, the guarantee that whatever truths emerged from the complete record would never see the light of day. It was an offer that most of the remaining custodian families found irresistible. They'd spent centuries carrying burdens they barely understood, maintaining traditions that increasingly made no sense in the modern world, protecting secrets that had become more dangerous with every passing year. The chance to finally lay down those burdens, to transfer responsibility to an institution with both the resources and the motivation to maintain absolute secrecy, was something their ancestors could never have imagined. But not everyone accepted the Vatican's offer. Some families, particularly those with the strongest genetic claims to the bloodlines in question, chose to remain in the shadows. They'd survived 7 centuries of persecution and containment efforts. They weren't about to surrender their patrimony to the same institution that had tried to erase their ancestors from history. These holdout families represent what Vatican containment specialists now recognize as the most serious ongoing threat to established order. Not because they're planning revolution or seeking to overthrow governments, but because they possess something far more dangerous in the modern age. They have proof. Genetic, historical, and documentary evidence that could substantiate claims about divine bloodlines, legitimate succession, and the true foundations of Western civilization. And unlike their medieval ancestors, they have access to technologies that make secrecy almost impossible to maintain. DNA databases, satellite archaeology, digital document analysis, social media genealogy, all of these tools make it increasingly difficult to hide evidence that previous generations could bury beneath layers of time and silence. The Vatican's current containment protocols acknowledge this reality. They're no longer trying to suppress evidence that might surface. Instead, they're working to control how that evidence is interpreted when it inevitably appears. Funding academic research that provides alternative explanations for genetic anomalies. Supporting archaeological projects that can provide conventional explanations for unusual discoveries. Maintaining relationships with media organizations that can ensure certain stories receive appropriate context when they break. It's a more sophisticated approach than medieval suppression, but it faces challenges that the Church's predecessors never had to consider. Because the same technologies that make secrecy difficult also make verification easier. Independent researchers can now confirm claims that would have required access to Vatican archives in previous eras. Genetic testing can validate bloodlines that were once matters of faith or folklore. Archaeological techniques can uncover evidence that was safely buried for centuries. The result is a race against time that the Vatican may already be losing. Every year brings new discoveries that align with claims in those Templar documents. Every advance in genetic analysis reveals new connections between modern families and ancient bloodlines. Every archaeological project uncovers new evidence that supports the most explosive allegations in those Jerusalem scrolls. But perhaps most concerning of all, from the Vatican's perspective, is the emergence of a new generation of custodian families. Young people who've grown up with access to technologies their ancestors couldn't imagine, who see secrecy not as protection, but as oppression, who view the containment protocols not as necessary security measures, but as historical injustice that demands correction. These individuals represent something the Church has never faced before: potential heirs to divine bloodlines who have no intention of hiding their heritage, who see their genetic and historical legacy not as a burden to be concealed, but as a truth to be proclaimed, who understand that in the age of social media and global communication, secrets can become movements overnight. And that's why those climate-controlled vaults beneath the Vatican contain more than just historical documents. They house contingency plans for scenarios that even the medieval church's most paranoid architects never imagined. Plans for what to do if the Templar legacy finally emerges from the shadows. If the bloodlines decide to reclaim their heritage. If the genetic evidence becomes too overwhelming to dismiss or contain. Because 7 centuries after the Knights Templar were officially destroyed, their greatest victory may be just beginning. So here we stand, 7 centuries after Friday the 13th, staring into an abyss that makes those medieval church fathers look prophetic in their paranoia. They saw the threat coming from miles away, understood what it would mean if divine authority could be proven through bloodlines rather than papal decree. They built containment systems that have lasted longer than most empires, created protocols so sophisticated they're still operational today. But containment only works if you can control every variable. And in an age where your DNA can be analysed from a coffee cup, where satellite imagery can reveal burial sites that have been hidden for millennia, where a single social media post can reach more people than medieval kings ever ruled. The variables are multiplying faster than any institution can track. The Vatican's archivists know this. Those climate-controlled vaults aren't just preserving the past anymore. They're preparing for a future where the past refuses to stay buried, where genetic testing companies become archaeological expeditions, where family trees become political manifestos, where the difference between conspiracy theory and documented fact gets smaller every day. The Knights Templar understood something that we're only beginning to grasp. Truth doesn't need institutions to survive. It just needs time. And after 700 years in the shadows, their time may finally be running out, or depending on your perspective, just beginning. The question isn't whether these secrets will surface, it's whether we're ready for what happens when they do, because some truths, once revealed, can't be contained again, and some bloodlines, once awakened, refuse to go back to sleep. The Templars are gone, but what they protected, what they preserved, what they passed down through 30 generations of careful guardianship, that's still out there, still waiting, still watching, and it's closer than you think.